You've all heard that the trenches of World War I were bad, but now you're going to see how bad they actually were, and why such a form of warfare was never repeated on such a scale. So if you're eating or something, you might want to skip this video. If you really want to stay and gross yourself out, let's get progressively more disturbing with the side of the First World War that rarely makes it into the movies, and the one veterans struggled most to describe. The trenches weren't expected by anyone when the war began. Everyone actually thought that it would be decided in a few months with open battles and cavalry charges. But the new weapons, like quick-firing artillery and machine guns, got coupled with the old tactics of charging in massed formation against the prepared defensive positions with barbed wire. And so this new form of combat was spontaneously born. And it came about because surviving soldiers had to dig in where they got pinned down and had nowhere else to go after their charge was mowed down, which happened over and over again. Already in the opening months of the war, the armies were getting soldiers killed on a scale that no one thought possible, and it was pretty much clear that if this went on a bit longer, they'd literally run out of soldiers to fight. All sides were trying to break their enemies' defensive positions and kept failing, and when frontal attacks obviously didn't work, they turned to flanking attempts. Now they try to go around the enemy's line and attack it from the side or rear. However, the reconnaissance planes, which were also a new thing, gave all sides eyes in the sky and for the first time real-time information on where the enemy was preparing the next attack. So the surprise element needed for a flanking maneuver was also out of the window. Each side would see the attack coming, extend the defensive position to meet it, break it up with catastrophic casualties, and then they try to do the same thing to the enemy, which again ended the same way. And they did this over and over again until they literally ran out of space. The lines of trenches hit the sea in the north and the neutral Swiss border in the south, and the Western Front was created. There was nowhere to go but forward, and going forward was getting everyone killed. So armies sat facing one another in hastily dug trenches, separated by what infamously became known as no man's land. The real horrors, never before seen in any war in history, were now about to begin. Now, what started as a simple ditch quickly evolved into a whole system. The line closest to the enemy was the front line, or fire trench where the sentries were and from where those pointless attacks were launched. Usually 100 yards or more behind it ran the support line, where men sheltered and could move up to reinforce the front, while further back was the reserve line, holding more troops and supplies. And running between all of them at right angles were the communication trenches. The whole thing was dug in a zigzag instead of a straight line, with corners called traverses every few yards, so a shell landing inside a trench would have its blast contained within that small section. Same goes for an enemy who dropped into the trench, meaning he couldn't fire straight down its whole length. The wall facing the enemy had a raised bank of earth and sandbags called the parapet, while the one at your back was called the parados. Cut into that front wall was the fire step that let a man stand high enough to shoot over the top when he had to. And dug into the walls were the dugouts. Anything from a sad little scrape with a ground sheet over it up to proper rooms, especially on the German side, many feet underground with timber supports and bunks. And the no man's land between the two front lines was anywhere from a few hundred yards across down to, in some places, as close as hand grenade range. Life inside the trenches ran on a routine. At dawn and again at dusk, the most likely times for an attack, every man was up on the fire step with his weapon ready, in a drill they called Stand 2. The rest of the day was sentry duty, fixing up the trench, hauling supplies, and a lot of nerve-wracking waiting. Units got rotated, so a battalion would do a stretch of days in the front line, and then drop back to support and reserve lines, then to rest billets behind the front, then cycle forward to do it again. And most of it was just boring and miserable time, interrupted by a random shell or bullet that came out of nowhere and killed a man, with the thought always in your mind of whether you'd be next. But before the horrors of the battle itself and the disturbing weapons and tactics meant to break the trenches, just being in them and doing nothing was getting men killed or scarred for life. In the low, flat parts of the line where the water table sat near the surface, the trenches easily flooded. Rain turned the floor into mud and the walls into sludge that slid back in on you. They'd lay down wooden walkways called duckboards, but in wet weather a trench could still be holding water up to your knee or even your waist. Some spots had pumps running around the clock and still couldn't keep the trench from flooding. And at its worst, men actually drowned in there in flooded shell holes or got sucked up by the deep mud, especially if they were wounded or weighed down with kit, which happened in quite a few battles. One of the most common everyday horrors was trench foot, which you get from standing for hours in cold water and mud. The feet go numb, swell up, and turn red, then blue, then black as the tissue dies. And in the bad cases, the rot turned to gangrene, and the foot, or part of the leg, had to come off. And the trenches were filthy, which bred rats in enormous numbers, feeding on scraps of food and, of course, on their main source of nutrition, the bodies of the dead, which were never in short supply. Rats grew huge, ran over men while they slept, bit them, ate their food, and spread disease. Lice were on absolutely everyone, causing a maddening itch and spreading what was called trench fever, which could put a man out of action for weeks. On top of that were the flies breeding in the waste of the dead and causing stomach diseases like dysentery. Not to mention the smell of rotting bodies, the open latrines, mixed with the burnt chemicals from the exploding shells, and the men packed inside a dugout with you who hadn't washed in days or weeks. Men killed out in no man's land often couldn't be reached, so they lay where they fell, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, in full view and full smell of the men still living. The dead got buried in a hurry in the floors and walls of the trenches and in shallow graves behind the line, and then shellfire would rip that ground open again and throw the remains back up. A wounded man stuck out in no man's land could be heard calling for help for days, with nobody able to reach him. Either the enemy fire was too heavy, or he was lying face down and you couldn't tell where his voice was coming from. The stretcher bearers did incredibly brave work, but they couldn't cross open ground under fire. A wounded man had to be left where he was until dark, all the time close enough for his comrades to hear him from the trench. Sometimes the two sides would hold their fire so the wounded could be collected. Other times, stretcher bearers were just another moving target. Because of snipers, which had also evolved in this war into what we know today, you couldn't lift your head above the parapet even for a moment without getting shot. They were watching the trenches all the time, and one careless movement could get you killed. Both sides leaned on camouflage and concealment, and they hunted each other's snipers. They used tricks like raising a dummy head on a stick to draw a shot, then triangulating a few shots from different spots to work out exactly where the sniper was hiding, so they could call the artillery in on him or send their own sniper to take him out. Now, out of all the ways a man could be killed or wounded out there, artillery was far and away the most common, blamed for as much as 2/3 of all casualties. High explosive and shrapnel killed and maimed more men than rifles, machine guns, gas, and every other weapon combined. Shrapnel shells burst up in the air and sprayed out a load of small metal balls, while high explosive shells had a violent blast that turned the wire, dirt, and wood into shrapnel. That left horrible, ragged wounds that were extremely hard to treat and to heal. And keep in mind, there were no antibiotics yet, so the men got all sorts of dirt driven down into these wounds, which then had to be carefully washed out with antiseptics. And that was the single biggest reason the First World War didn't end up as the war with the most gangrene, sepsis, and amputation, the way the American Civil War had been, for example, back when nobody properly understood germs yet. Besides that, artillery also collapsed trenches and dugouts on top of people, so it was horribly easy to get buried alive during the barrage. Some men got dug out in time. Some, well, were never found. And these bombardments ranged from a single shell fired once in a while to harass the enemy, all the way up to sustained barrages that went on for hours or even days. The shells came down so fast and so close that the noise never broke, just one long continuous sound the men called drum fire. There was nothing you could do but press against the ground and wait. You didn't know whether the bombardment was preparation for the attack that would come as soon as the artillery lifted, or whether the gas shells were mixed in. Speaking of gas, it's absolutely the worst possible way to die in the trenches, but before I gross you out with that, just take a look at what the artillery did to soldiers who weren't even hit by it directly. Men just broke, shaking, unable to speak, unable to move, going deaf or blind with no physical injury to explain any of it. They called it shell shock, and at first they figured it was the blast physically doing something to the brain, or that it was the helmet channeling the force of the blast up into the head. But then men who'd never been near an explosion started showing the exact same symptoms. The real cause was the unbearable grinding strain of it all, the possibility of getting killed at any moment and living in that state for months or years. Like I said, poison gas was the first brand new weapon brought in specifically to break the deadlock, and arguably the worst way to die. The first big gas attack came when the Germans opened thousands of cylinders of chlorine gas and let the wind carry a cloud across to the French and French colonial troops on the other side. It was the first such attack, but definitely not the last one. It was so effective, so much so that even the Germans were shocked by what it did, and they weren't prepared to exploit the whole 4-mile trench line collapsing. From there, the gases only got worse. They got put into artillery shells and fired in among the standard barrage to mask them, so the soldiers wouldn't put on their gas mask before they'd inhaled enough to kill them. Phosgene gas came after chlorine, and it was far deadlier and harder to recognize. It had a faint smell and showed its effects only hours later, when you'd been thinking you were fine after inhaling several times the lethal dose. Gas goes into the lungs where it turns into acid that burns them and causes massive swelling, with fluid leaking out and gathering inside them. Slowly but surely, the soldier would literally drown from the inside. Later came the mustard gas that didn't attack lungs, but caused huge blisters on the skin that wouldn't necessarily kill a soldier, but left him wounded in a way that cost the enemy more than a dead man would. If you want to really go down the rabbit hole of chemical weapons of World War I, you can watch our whole video on that later. Besides the chemicals, there were flamethrowers, used this way for the first time, from small portable ones to huge flame projectors that were dug into the front trenches and sprayed fire before the attack. But for all the horrors they caused, artillery, gas, and flames never actually gave anyone the breakthrough they were supposed to, so they went further. Then came the tanks, which were pretty much as deadly to their crews as to the enemy, and they were barely able to cross a few hundred yards on a road without breaking down, not to mention crossing no man's land. However, there was a whole war inside this war that was going on under no man's land: tunnels. Very soon into the deadlock, someone got the idea to bring in civilians who specialized in digging underground, like coal miners and later the infamous clay kickers. They dig a small tunnel under no man's land, and the idea was to plant massive mines under the enemy's positions and then blow them up just before the big attack. This soon became a widespread tactic on both sides, and after seeing how effective it could be in just a few instances, both sides were trying to disrupt the enemy's tunneling. Listening became the main way to detect them, so tunnelers had to dig as silently as possible, because the other side would start digging a tunnel towards them. They'd dig a tunnel under them and place what was called a camouflage charge that would explode and collapse the tunnel and make it impossible to dig in that area again. So besides all the horrors coming from above, soldiers in the trenches also wondered whether a huge mine was being planted under them, ready to blow them to pieces. Meanwhile, the people doing the digging had their own share of horrors in the unstable ground under the battlefield. Besides running into the enemy tunnel, which did happen on a few occasions where a fight broke out underground, they also faced everyday dangers, like the tunnel caving in, hitting a water layer and drowning, a build-up of carbon monoxide, or artillery hitting their tunnel entrance and burying them alive. That happened with the German tunnelers when about 200 of them were left underground and never found. You can also watch our video on World War I tunnelers if you want to see more of that. Now, it was this miserable for everyone in the trenches, and no matter how often the war stripped them of their humanity, these were all still people. So the men sometimes worked out quiet, unspoken little understandings with the enemy right across from them. The two sides would sort of agree, without ever saying it out loud, not to shoot during certain hours, to leave each other alone at mealtimes, or to drop their artillery at the same predictable times and places. This became known as the live and let live system, and the commanders hated it, because they wanted their men keeping up that so-called fighting spirit and preying on each other like animals. But for the ordinary soldier, he just wanted it over. The most famous example you've definitely heard of was the Christmas truce of 1914, when men of both sides climbed up out of their trenches, met in no man's land, and spent a bit of time together. And the commanders couldn't stand it and broke it up by ordering raids and bombardments to force the killing to start again. And discipline in the trenches was its own way to get killed, only this time by your own side. A man who ran from the line, abandoned his post, or just couldn't make himself climb out into an assault could be charged with desertion or cowardice, or even shot on the spot. And that happened quite a lot, especially when a man refused to go over the top in yet another hopeless attack. The British Army, for example, handed down more than 3,000 death sentences over the course of the war, and actually carried out around 350 of them. The British government in 2006 issued a posthumous pardon to 306 of those executed men, finally accepting they'd been treated unjustly. Now, although most famous, this deadlock and all its misery wasn't only a Western Front story. It showed up in its own forms anywhere armies dug in and couldn't move, as it did on Gallipoli or in the Alps between Italy and Austria-Hungary. So what finally cracked this whole deadlock open? The Germans began using specially trained assault troops called stormtroopers. They worked in small groups and were trained to find the weak spots on the line and punch through the rear, going around the strong points instead of stopping to fight them. They tried it on a huge scale in the Great German Offensive that opened on the 21st of March 1918, and at first it genuinely worked. They broke the trench stalemate for the first time and pushed far into Allied territory. However, Germany was by this point strangled by the naval blockade and couldn't sustain the war anymore, and this final offensive was more like one last big gamble that utterly failed after the stormtroopers outran their supply lines. And what finally broke the deadlock for good wasn't any one wonder weapon, but taking everything they'd learned and using it together in one coordinated method. Infantry, tanks, aircraft, and artillery now working together, covering each other's weak spots, is what finally broke the trenches completely and started the 100-day offensive that ended the war.